Okay, yes, now it's working. Wow, welcome everybody. It's a full packed room. It's a long, long day. They moved us this way and that way, but we all ended up here because the students organizing this are amazing. And we're patient, as my comrade and colleague Key Williams sitting there says, re-quoting, rephrasing Martin Luther King, the arc of justice is long, but we move with it. So thank you all for the students who organized this. There's a student event, the students who are outside organizing every day, daily, doing the work of organizing students, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, atheist, anarchist, communist, undecided, LGBTQ, straight, black, brown, Arab, white, Asian, migrant, native, from the south, from the north, from the east, from the west, wild, nerdy, traumatized, centered, hopeful, strong. Strong students. They're strong students. They've stood strong and they're standing strong. Some have also organized and mobilized here before throughout many other moments that have required organizing, strikes through the mobilizations following the murder of George Floyd. The students who are and have set up the encampment outside in the lobby have been eloquent, they've been passionate, and they've been precise in their demands. And they've been fearless in their moral position. That's, in a way, partly why we're here tonight with another person who's been fearless, holding to their moral position. They live out their convictions, and in doing that, they are changing the ground on which we all stand. Because the ground is shifting. It's shifting from here to California to Texas. Do you feel it shifting? Yeah. Do you feel it shifting? Yes. And in shifting the ground and doing so, students are questioning the very purpose of education in an amoral world today, as we should all be. And they're challenging the institutionality of institutions, beholden as these are to the hijacked powers of the state and of corporate capital. And how blatantly have we seen Columbia and NYU and Yale and others reveal themselves to be just that, hijacked institutions cravenly bowing to Congress, to billionaire donors deciding to call in NYPD. And by the way, some of you know this, but Robert Kraft, who today or yesterday said, I'm not going to give any more money to Columbia, is also a big donor to the NYPD police union. Those two things are not incidental. Right? We know that. In fact, the power of NYU and Columbia to call in the police is also related to their power to take over land in the East Village and in northern Manhattan and in Harlem. So we have institutions cornered into treating inquiry and peaceful dissent as terrorism. That's what Mitch McConnell called it yesterday, right? Pro-terrorist mobs demanding that federal law enforcement step in. I mean, we're in this territory, folks. This is here now. Right, and that's why you're doing this. Calling specifically to kick out foreign students? And to tell us what we may think, what we may do. Right? That is part of the pressure, what we may think and what we may do. So that encampment out there that is resisting that pressure is itself an expression of freedom. And you, the students across the nation now, everywhere, but our students here outside who've been doing this, many of us know them personally, are the heroes of the moment. I think they're making a map of a world more moral and just than the one being imposed by those who protect the accumulation of their power and capital with arms, by recruiting dispossessed foot soldiers and putting them in uniforms and sending them in to repress dissent with guns, batons, and jail time. I do want to commend the administration and the faculty in this university who have so far decided not to take the fascist route. That is why we managed to, with the pressure of the faculty and the pressure of the student organizers, to be able to take back this auditorium. But anyway, in short, thank you to the young student. This is really your stage. You should be up here with your microphones. But for now, here we are, two old men with microphones. I will briefly introduce Dr. Norman Finkelstein, who, as the cliche goes, needs no introduction. But before I do that, I want to go over some very basic rules, and I want to thank Jaskier and Dylan for some of this. The first teaching at the university after the events, Jaskier and Dylan, Siddhartha Dev, who must be somewhere around, organized that, and I thank them for doing that work to get that done. So the basic rules: Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and other discriminatory language and conduct will not be tolerated. Mention of Israel refers to a nation state, not to the Jewish people or the Jewish religion, and the two should not be conflated. Similarly, all mention of Arab countries refer to particular nation states, not Muslim people or the religion of Islam, and the two should not be conflated. We're here also because academic freedom is paramount. I think Norman knows something about that. We're not active, neither of us here, none of you out there, I don't think, none of us are active duty soldiers in an ongoing war. We're conducting a discussion, so all questions and challenges are welcome as long as they are respectful. We will try to de-escalate disruptive behavior in order to allow attendees to benefit from this in an educational setting. There will be a Q&A opportunity after the talk. I will ask you to, well, I'm not going to ask you to line up at the mics because there are no mics, but maybe I will ask you to, or there are these mics, but the setup has changed. So I will ask you to maybe line up at the steps and I will pass you this mic. I will ask you also to not make statements, but ask questions. We all like that. Keep them to about 3 minutes. I will stop you if you start going over. Some people have a problem doing that. I don't. Okay, so these are the rules that are established for our being together here today, this evening. I hope everybody will be able to respect that. And now finally, Norman Finkelstein, folks. I'll be very brief with the bio, and I hope this works. But son of Holocaust survivors who were Stalinists till the very end of their lives, Norman Finkelstein was himself a long-time Maoist who then abandoned the line, and following Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, began to turn his attention to Israel, and especially later the Israeli state's ongoing assault on Gaza. This led to years of research and scholarship, digging up contradictions, fabrications, and outright lies in what he himself calls a forensic scholarship, forensic critiques of the truth claims of the Israeli state and its defending scholars. A meticulous researcher with a moral backbone and unbending principles, he has paid a price for his position on the subject, and many over the last few months have paid that price as well. People who have been fired, some in this room, people who have been let go, punished, suspended. Having been denied tenure by DePaul University in 2007 in a greatly publicized case. But it turns out there is life outside the academy. He has had epic debates that have been watched by hundreds of thousands of people online and continued to publish on the subject until 2019. Then his book, I Accuse, referring back to the Dreyfus affair, was read, according to his own estimate, by about only 100 people. And he thought maybe the effort isn't worth it right now. So he decided to stop or pause, because now he's back in the fight. Though he himself claims that his core political opinions are conventional and mainstream. Dr. Finkelstein has been here before. I think the last time was in 2012. I know. What happened? The panel fell. He was here on a panel on Zionism. Since then, many things have changed, and many have not. I suspect we will hear about some of both in today's talk. Please welcome Norman Finkelstein again.
Thank you for having me here this evening. And it's an important occasion, not the meeting itself, but the moment, where I do believe if organization emerges, solid leadership emerges, and clear-headedness seizes the day, there are real prospects, at least, and I'm not being facetious here, at least until graduation, that students can have a real impact, perhaps in preventing the impending Israeli assault on Rafah. But I'll get to that at the very end. For now, I would like to do two things this evening. Number one is to, so to speak, fill in the background to what happened on October 7th and thereafter. And secondly, be part of a conversation with the people in the room about what used to be called tactics and strategy, to talk brass tacks as to what's the way to go forward. I don't claim to have any monopoly on truth in that regard, but I can make a claim to life experience, now going on 41 years, having to do with the Israel-Palestine conflict, and also having given the matter a lot of reflection. So, to begin with, to fill in, so to speak, the background story, to give some sense of where I think things are currently headed, and then to have that substantive conversation about the way forward. Let me begin with October 7th itself, to give what I take to be a fairly clear record of some basic facts, though I believe a lot of what happened is still murky, and quite likely we'll never know the full truth about significant aspects of October 7th. So, henceforth, I'm going to give you my best speculation, since there's very little in the way of a documentary record at this point. I think I prefer that to an assassin's bullet. The overarching objective of Hamas was to shatter the political status quo. In the course of trying to achieve that objective, it clearly targeted military and intelligence facilities abutting Gaza in Israel. It clearly intended to take military hostages. It's less definite that it intended to take civilian hostages, but that can't be ruled out. It's a reasonable possibility, but it's not yet a certainty. There was an intended civilian massacre, but it's very unclear what was the scale that was intended of that civilian massacre. About 1,200 people were killed, of whom approximately 850 were civilians. Now, there are many other aspects of what happened on October 7th, which have been disproven, I think, at this point, at least claims which I noticed were repeated during the House of Representatives hearings, claims about beheadings of babies. Those have been, so far as one can tell, they have also been discarded by the Israeli government. The claims of rapes or systematic rapes keeps recurring, especially in venues like the New York Times. I do not believe the evidence bears out the claim of systematic rapes. In fact, paradoxically, the main document that's being put forth to support the claim, namely the document by the UN official Pramila Patten, it's a 17-page, it's about a skimpy report, but if that's the best proof that rapes occurred on a systematic, methodical basis, it actually, to my mind, it proves the contrary. Why do I say that? I can't go into all the details of the Pramila Patten report, but a couple of things do stand out, or I should say 3 things stand out. Number 1, Patten states, or her report states, that there was no photographic or digital evidence of sexual violence on October 7th. Now, that's a quite stunning revelation. She said, or the report stated, that they went through 5,000 photographs and 50 hours of digital footage. 50 hours is not a trivial amount. If you just do the math, if you were on your video for 8 hours, I should say, if you were on your computer for 8 hours a day, and I'm afraid some of you are, you have to multiply that by 6, nearly a week before you get through all the footage that she went through. Now, she says, and I'm quoting her now, the 50 hours of digital footage was based on militants' body cams and dash cams, individual cell phones, CCTV, and traffic surveillance cameras. That pretty much covers the gamut. And remember, this is an area which is abutting Gaza, which means it's probably the most surveilled area in all of Israel. And they did not find one, literally, sometimes people use that expression hyperbolically, but here I'm using it literally. They did not find one photographic image of sexual violence in all those 5,000 photographs and 50 hours of digital footage. Number two, she said we found no medico-legal, which is just a technical term, for forensic evidence of sexual violence on October 7th. And number three, not one actual survivor of sexual violence stepped forward, I should say, of sexual violence on October 7th, stepped forward to meet with her committee. I conclude from that there was no systematic, methodical cases or systematic, methodical plan to rape on October 7th, but obviously it doesn't exclude the possibility of an incident here or an incident there. That, however, was not the claim. The claim was it was systematic and methodical, and based on what I just said, plus other evidence which I've gone through, I do not believe that claim can be sustained. Having said that, I don't think the purpose of this exercise this evening is to pretend as if nothing happened on October 7th. Something did, and I would say you'd have to acknowledge the atrocities were of a significant magnitude. I'm not going to deny that. What I would prefer to do is to try to make sense of what happened on October 7th, rather than to deny anything happened on that date or anything significant happened on that date. And I was gratified. I have appeared, even though it sometimes appears as if I've been everywhere. In fact, I've only been in a very, very limited podcast universe. No, it's true. It's a kind of optical illusion of the web by virtue of two things. Number one, the algorithm. So if you search for me once on YouTube, for the next month, my face will haunt you. But not because I'm everywhere, but just because of the algorithm. And number two, because you can do a 1-hour interview, and then an enterprising podcaster will then turn it into 10,000 one-minute clips. But in fact, I've not been almost anywhere. The only program with broad reach that I've been on was Piers Morgan. And by the fourth time I was on, he did do something which I was respectful of him for. He said, instead of talking about October 7th, let's talk about what led up to October 7th, the background story. And I was on with Professor Dershowitz, and I made a tactical decision that I would simply ignore him, whatever he had to say, and proceed on what I called my timeline. So each time Piers Morgan referred back to me, I said, now, where I left off in my timeline, and that's what I'm going to do today. I'd like to give you a timeline, which is, I hope, is scrupulous to the facts, but nonetheless, obviously, for purposes of time, is going to be selective. The first question is, how did Gaza become Gaza? And that really begins during the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948, when in the course of Israel's expulsion of about 90% of the population that became the state of Israel, about 300,000 of those expelled ended up in Gaza. And so we should always bear in mind, as we watch the scenes unfold, that as of now, approximately 80% of the people of Gaza are refugees and descendants of refugees. That's, in my opinion, the first most important fact that we should lodge in your memory. And the second fact, which ought to be remembered, is that of the population of Gaza, 1/2 are children. So when you hear about things like an impending, or at this point, actually unfolding famine in Gaza, not that adults don't have a right to live, though that's sometimes forgotten, as it's sometimes forgotten that adult males have the right to live in Gaza, as if the only crime is that women and children are killed in Gaza. But having said that, I think it's important to bear in mind half the population of Gaza are children. Now, right after the expulsion from Israel into Gaza, there were what the Israeli historian Denny Morris called, in his book Border Wars, which is actually an excellent book, he describes that between 1949 and roughly 1953, Palestinian expellees from the West Bank and from Gaza, they attempted to return to their homes. And they were, according to Benny Morris, 90% of those who attempted to return home were what he describes as economic infiltrees, which is to say they had no weapons, they were unarmed, they just wanted to see their fields, their families, their relatives, and in some cases to harvest their crops. And Morris says that between 1949 and roughly 1953, Israel killed 2,700 to 5,000 of these expellees. And if you read his book, and I would strongly recommend it, they were killed in the most gruesome ways imaginable. I myself, although I had thought I was inured to the horrors of what have befallen the people of Gaza and the West Bank, I myself was quite shocked at the descriptions he provided of what happened in the course of those years. In 1956, Israel, along with the UK and France, they invaded Egypt, and in the course of their invasion of Egypt, Israel occupied Gaza. And Morris describes what happened in Gaza. The two cities which he mentions are at this point probably well known to most people in the audience. He describes what he calls, and I'm using his words, the massacres in Gaza. And I'll just quote him. The day Khan Yunis was conquered, remember this is 1956, not 2023. The day Khan Yunis was conquered, IDF troops shot dead hundreds of Palestinian refugees and local inhabitants in the town. Then, in Rafah, Israeli troops killed between 48 and 100 refugees and several local residents, and wounded another 61 during a massive screening operation. Another 66 Palestinians, probably Fedayeen guerrillas, were executed in a number of other incidents. The United Nations estimated that all told, Israeli troops killed between 447 and 550 Arab civilians in the first 3 weeks of the occupation of the Strip. As I proceed, I was introduced as an old man, which is alas the case, but I would have to say that everything I'm describing at this point occurred within the lifetime of people like myself. I had already emerged from my mother's womb by 1956. The experiences I'm narrating are still fresh in the minds of the people of Gaza. It's not ancient history. After 1967, Ariel Sharon, who was the chief of the Southern Command in the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, he proceeded in order to repress the people of Gaza to carry out what were called thinning out operations, in the course of which tens of thousands of Gazans were, to quote him, uprooted and sent to detention camps. That's, so to speak, the first floor of the story history of Gaza. In 1987, when I was already an adult, the first Intifada, the outbreak of civil resistance to the Israeli occupation, I have to say, with all due regard to my respected friend, Crystal Ball, that when she was posed the question by Piers Morgan a couple of nights ago, she was asked, I think I'll get the words almost exactly right. She was asked, when in the last 75 years has the word intifada not meant murderous violence against Jews? Well, as a factual matter, I'm old enough to remember, the term intifada was first coined in 1987. It literally meant, there are some Arab speakers in the room, so they'll correct me if I'm mistaken. It literally meant a dog shaking off its fleas. That's what intifada means. And the uprising it began in Gaza, in Jabalia camp. The uprising was overwhelmingly, everybody agrees, it was overwhelmingly a nonviolent civil resistance through the first couple of years. Well, the people of Gaza, as I said, that's where the uprising began. And by 1991, the uprising began December 7, 1987. By 1991, Israel instituted what it called a closure policy in Gaza. And basically that meant the beginnings of the sealing off of Gaza from the world. By the early 2000s, there seemed to have been a consensus among knowledgeable people that, well, let me just quote it to you. Baruch Kimmerling, who was a senior sociologist at the Hebrew University, he described Gaza in his book Politicide. He described Gaza as, quote, the largest concentration camp ever. Now, some of you might think, well, Professor Kimmerling was probably a leftist, and in fact he was. But it's not as if his opinion was exceptional. If you take the case of, his name just slipped my mind, it'll come back to me. This is old age. It's called the senior moment. The former head of the Israeli National Security Council. And he said in March 2003, I'm quoting, 2004. In March 2004, he said Gaza was, quote, a huge concentration camp. Now, bear in mind, those descriptives are before the blockade had been inflicted on Gaza. By 2006, January 2006, there was parliamentary elections among the Palestinians, and Hamas surprisingly won those elections. And the immediate reaction, nobody disputes the elections were democratic. Jimmy Carter, the former US president, is monitoring them, and he called them completely fair and honest elections. The immediate reaction of Israel was to impose a brutal economic blockade on Gaza. And then the US and the EU joined in the blockade. I can't go through all the details of what then ensued. There were some ups and downs. There was a period when Israel instituted a policy of what it called a humanitarian minimum caloric allowance for the people of Gaza. And that meant humanitarian minimum is the euphemism for a starvation plus diet was put on the people of Gaza. And in the course of that diet, as they called it, that was inflicted on Gaza, Israel denied entry of any chocolate, potato chips, baby chicks, spices. All of that was prohibited from entering Gaza. And their objective, which is laid out in writing, was to keep Gaza on the brink of an economic catastrophe. By the eve of October 7th, the British Economist, not a radical magazine, it described Gaza as a human rubbish heap. That was Gaza. They had the highest unemployment in the world. 50% of the population was unemployed. 60% of the youth were unemployed. 80% of the population was living off of, to use our term, public assistance. 50% of the population was food insecure. And as most of you know, as a result of the blockade, nobody could go into Gaza, nobody could leave Gaza. The South African application to the International Court of Justice noted among many facts that about 400, a little less than 400, Gazans died because they were denied the right to leave Gaza to get better medical care. So, as of October 7th, the people of Gaza, and I would say in particular the young people who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th, they had no past, no present, and so far as anybody could tell, they had no future except to languish and die in this concentration camp. But that's not the full picture. There are two other aspects. Number one, Israel periodically went into Gaza to to carry out what it called a mowing of the lawn. And mowing of the lawn meant a high-tech massacre. That's the less, well, first of all, mowing of the lawn to begin with is a diabolical, in my opinion, a diabolical expression when you bear in mind that if you have in your own mind's eye the notion of a lawnmower with its blades and mowing the lawn where 1 million blades of grass on the lawn are children, it's basically the image of a lawnmower cracking, shattering the skulls of children. And there's something to be said, in my opinion, that phrase, mowing the lawn, to describe those periodic high-tech massacres in Gaza, that phrase it's so easily rolled off the tongue of people who used it, which was most mainstream commentators, till this day, I should say. The main massacres or mowings of the lawn occurred in 2008-9, which was Operation Cast Lead. 2012, I should point out, Amnesty International described Operation Cast Lead in a large report, a quite substantial report, as 22 days of death and destruction. 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense, and then 51 days of death and destruction, namely Operation Protective Edge. The head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, his job was to tour war zones. And when Maurer toured Gaza after Operation Protective Edge, he said, "Never in my life have I seen so much destruction as I did in Gaza." Now, if you look at the record, I think it's correct to say that nothing that Israel has done since October 7th, nothing that has done breaks any precedent except, and critically, the magnitude. But the targeting of civilians, the targeting of hospitals, the targeting of medical personnel, the targeting of children, all of that is old hat when it comes to Israel's conduct in Gaza. I want to make one comment, but I'll get to it in a moment. So, beside the fact that Gaza was a concentration camp by the reckoning of the former head of Israel's National Security Council, beside that fact, there were the periodic massacres inflicted on Gaza. Now, you might say, horrible as that is, why didn't Hamas try diplomacy, try negotiations? Why didn't it try nonviolent civil resistance? The record shows, and I'll have to be brief with the record, that beginning with Hamas's coming to power in 2006, it did moderate its political program, and it seemed on critical issues to be in alignment or reaching towards alignment with the international consensus, the two-state settlement, whatever you think of it, that was the international consensus, and Hamas was moving in that direction. were there problems with its position? I would say there were areas of ambiguity, for sure, but had Israel sought a settlement, it was certainly a possibility. Whether it was a probability, I can't say, because Israel never sought a settlement. Israel wanted to destroy Hamas and to pacify the people of Gaza. Number two, it's often forgotten that the people of Gaza did try nonviolent civil resistance. It's not as if that idea was wholly alien to them. Beginning in March 30th, 2018, the people of Gaza embarked on what was called the Great March of Return. And its two main demands were to lift the blockade of Gaza and also to exercise their legal right of return. Now, what happened when they tried the nonviolent civil resistance? We have a very good record, which is well worth looking at. The UN investigative body went to Gaza to look at what happened. And it was significantly comprised of three jurists of prominence. And here's what they found. They said that the Great March of Return, as some of you might remember, it began on a festive note. Families came out, set up encampments. There were circus acts, there was dancing, there was music. There was an attempt to create a celebratory environment as they embarked on this new adventure of nonviolent civil resistance. What happened? You know exactly what happened. Israel took its best snipers, and the snipers lined the perimeter fence with Gaza. According to Israel, every bullet that was fired, that's what Israel says, every bullet that was fired is accounted for. It hit its mark, exactly as you would expect, because it was pretty much shooting fish in a barrel. It was their best snipers, and there was a festive, celebratory atmosphere in Gaza. And who did the snipers hit or target? Well, according to this investigative body, and it's amply documented in the report is 250 single-spaced pages, and a large proportion is given over to what happened to those festive Gazans. The report said Israel targeted children. Israel targeted medics. Israel targeted journalists. And as macabre as it sounds, the report says Israel targeted disabled people. That is to say, if you read the report, the people it targeted, I should say children and adults it targeted, they were between 150 and 300 meters from the perimeter fence. They were just leaning against trees, consuming food. They targeted double amputees. They targeted people on crutches. This was not the fog of war. This was the targeting of civilians, utterly, totally premeditated acts of murder. And for anybody who's studied nonviolent civil resistance, nonviolent civil resistance cannot work unless it evokes a reaction from what you might call the bystanders. So in the case of our own nonviolent resistance, our own being, American history, during the civil rights movement, there was no way the civil rights movement could have succeeded unless it evoked a reaction from the northern part of our country and from the federal government. If the civil rights activists had been left to the mercies of the Southern folk during the civil rights movement, they would have been brutally repressed with not a little amount of murder. It was the reaction from outside the South that, and eventually the putting in of federal troops, that caused Southerners to desist. Now, the people in Gaza, to their misfortune, and we're not talking about ancient history, we're talking about 6 years ago, they discovered that nobody was coming to their assistance. Even, I have to say, with a certain amount of chagrin, even the Solidarity movement ignored the Great March of Return and the attempt at civil resistance. And so, on the eve of October 7th, the people of Gaza, they had attempted negotiations, it didn't work. Or I should say the leadership attempted a diplomatic solution, it didn't work. They attempted nonviolent civil resistance, it was a catastrophe. And so those who want to condemn what happened on October 7th, it does seem to me that they have a moral burden of their own, which is they have to lay out what were the options that the people of Gaza had, what were the alternatives that they had, or if you can't present a tenable, a viable option, then you have to acknowledge that you were in effect saying that it was okay that the fate of the people of Gaza would be to languish and die in a concentration camp. And it was because I was more familiar than most to the details of what had befallen the people of Gaza, that from day one, even though by the fourth day it became clear atrocities of a significant magnitude unfolded on October 7th, I was unwilling, even as I acknowledged that atrocities had occurred, I was unwilling to condemn the perpetrators of those atrocities for the same reason, for those of you who know American history, for the same reason that the abolitionists, those were white and black folk, but here I'll focus on the white folks, the abolitionists were unwilling to condemn the slave revolts, even though the slave revolts were very brutal. If you take the major slave revolt in our country, the biggest was Nat Turner in 1831, Nat Turner gave the order, as far as historians are able to ascertain, he gave the order, kill all whites. That was his order, kill all white people. And that's what they proceeded to do. They went from house to house, went into the bedroom, took out the axe, and chopped off the heads of babies. That's a fact, nobody disputes it. They smashed the skulls of men and women. It was a very ugly affair. But when the abolitionists, in particular William Lloyd Garrison, had to comment on the slave revolt, he began by saying, "We told you so. We told you so." He was speaking to his fellow whites. If you treat people this way, if you demean them, degrade them, exploit them, ravish them, then it's inevitable that this, meaning the Nat Turner revolt, will happen. And William Lloyd Garrison was very careful to acknowledge horrors occurred during the revolt. He said it twice in his editorial. And if you read the editorial very carefully, you'll discover he never once condemned Nat Turner. And I think the reason is very obvious, because you take someone like Nat Turner, who was an extremely smart guy. Even white folks said, Nat's a smart guy. He was highly literate. He knew the Bible like the back of his hand. And one biographer describes this chasm, what he describes this vast chasm in Nat Turner. The chasm between what his potential was. He could have done great things in his life, or even good things in his life. And the fact that he had to bear each day when he got up that he was going to be a slave for the rest of his life. And he could not reconcile the dreams he harbored as a human being with the fate that had been meted out to him. And it is my opinion that that was the primary motivation of the young men who were born into a concentration camp, most of them that were in their 20s. By 2004, as I said, even Israel's head of National Security Council is a very nasty guy, by the way. Even he was described as a concentration camp. Nat Turner was born into slavery. They were born into a concentration camp, a very small concentration camp, 26 miles long, the length of a marathon, and 5 miles wide. 5 miles is the distance I jog every day along the Coney Island seashore. That's it. And all they had to look forward to, because most of them were unemployed, all they had to look forward to is pacing those 26 miles by 5 miles for the rest of their life. Just like all Nat Turner had to look forward to was being a slave. Now you might say, but why did they have to do what they did? You can also say, why did Nat Turner have to give the order, kill all the whites? You may not like that, and I can certainly understand recoiling at it, but I also understand, because I was faced with the same conundrum after October 7th, I can understand why William Lloyd Garrison couldn't condemn them. Because he saw them every day being degraded, being demeaned, their whole life's hopes and aspirations being emasculated by this system that had been imposed on them. And it's 1831, long before the Civil War. There was no hope or possibility for anything else. Just like the people of Gaza on October 6th, what did they see? They saw that while they were imprisoned, immured in this concentration camp, Israel, the US, and the Saudis were trying to figure out how to make an agreement over the heads of the people of Gaza. And so they saw their prospects as doomed. Now, I have to ask where we are with time.
7 o'clock.
7. And we get,
7:10.
and we're here till?
8:02.
Okay. I want to go through now what's happened and where we're headed. The first question, the first obvious question is, how do we explain Israel's reaction, namely the last 6 months? And there I would say it has 3 components. You could say on a spectrum, but they are not distinct components. First of all, there was, and it's not surprising, there was the bloodlust, the desire to exact revenge for what happened on October 7th. That I would say is not uncommon, so I can't express shock at what happened, though the magnitude has reached a point where one can say it's bordering on insane, and maybe is insane. One other aspect of the bloodlust was the fury and the anger at the Israelis. Not that the massacre occurred, but that they had been outwitted and outsmarted by these Untermenschen, these subhumans in Gaza. And that's really how they are viewed, and Israelis take pride in themselves as being the Übermenschen, the supermen. When I was growing up, Israel was a kind of James Bond state, high-tech, carrying out these military operations, most famously Entebbe, raid on Entebbe, but others. And they took great pride in their intelligence capacity, their high-tech surveillance capacity, and overall, the military readiness of their civilian army. And suddenly, the underside of Israeli society was exposed, not least the weaknesses in its military surveillance technical capacities. And that enraged the Israelis and compounded the bloodlust. The second element, and as I say, it's not a spectrum or a continuum, the second element was what Israel calls its deterrence capacity, which is just a fancy term for the Arab world's fear of Israel. And there was a concern, in my opinion, a legitimate concern. After October 7th, a feeling began to percolate in the Arab world at the popular level. A feeling began to percolate of, hey, maybe those Israelis aren't as invincible as we all thought. which is to say, a feeling began to crystallize that there was a military option against Israel. And Israel was determined by carrying out this genocide in Gaza to transmit to the Arab world that if you think you have a military operation, take a look at what's going to happen to you if you, like Hamas, attempt to carry out a military option against us. And it's hard to say how successful that is. It hasn't deterred the Hezbollah in South Lebanon. However, the Hezbollah resistance has been limited due to the fears of the Lebanese people that Israel might do to Lebanon what it did or has been doing to Gaza. And the third aspect along this continuum, the third aspect is, as everybody knows, the cliche, whenever there is a crisis, there is also an opportunity. And Israel saw the crisis of October 7th as an opportunity to, for once and for all, solve this Gaza question. And so even as they lamented the deaths that occurred, they also saw it as an occasion to, as I pointed out, beginning with right after the first Arab-Israeli war, there had been resistance by Gaza, people of Gaza who are overwhelmingly refugees, to the fate that had been meted out to them. And now, as one Israeli said, I was surprised when I read my own book because I had forgotten. At the very end of the book, I quote one Israeli senior official from 2015 saying, we can't keep having these wars of attrition in Gaza, namely Kasleh, Pillar Defense, Protective Edge. And he said, in ominously prescient terms, he said, the next war in Gaza will be the last. And it turned out, as I said, well, it may not be the last, but certainly Israel is acting as if it wants it to be the last. What is it attempting to do now? Again, I would say 3 points on a continuum. Number one, Israel started by trying to carry out an ethnic cleansing. And it hoped, it was perfectly obvious, that it would sweep the people of Gaza into the Egyptian Sinai, but the Egyptian president, Sisi, vetoed that, not because he's a humanitarian, very far from it, he's a monster. However, he said, we are not going to solve your Gaza problem. And so that was not a possibility. The next point on the spectrum was to make Gaza uninhabitable. And that's basically what Israel has been doing the last 6 months. Giora Island, he was the head of national security, he came to me, a senior moment in reverse. Giora Island said, we have to tell the people of Gaza they have 2 choices, either to stay and starve or leave. And that's exactly what Israel is doing. It's giving the people of Gaza, or Israel is giving the people of Gaza 2 choices, to stay and starve or to leave, to make Gaza unlivable. The last report I read from the World Bank said that Israel had destroyed 290,000 dwellings in Gaza, That means over 1 million people don't have a home to return to. But it's not only they don't have a home to return to, it's literally the case they don't know where to return, because all of northern Gaza is now a parking lot. It's not that you can't just find your home, you can't find your block, you can't find your neighborhood, you can't even find your city. To make Gaza unlivable. And the third point along the spectrum is just to commit an outright genocide. And that's been the case, as most of you know, that's being litigated at the International Court of Justice, and the court found by a vote of 15-2 that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide. Just the other day, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, that Selim, it put out a report that Israel has manufactured a famine in Gaza, which is the consensus of all humanitarian organizations and also UN officials, that this is a man-made or human-made famine that's now occurring in Gaza. And in the course of the report, which is worth reading, they make the point, some of you will recall that the Prime Minister of Israel said that we have to treat these people of Gaza like Amalek. And there was some dispute about what he meant by Amalek. Did he mean Hamas? Did he mean the whole population? And that someone said that I found to be an interesting or a useful clarification. That someone said everybody who was raised in Israeli schools with our educational system, everybody understands that when Prime Minister Netanyahu says Amalek, and now I'm quoting the report, everybody understands who has gone through our educational system, Amalek means he called it a dog whistle. That's what that someone called it, a dog whistle, which means every man, woman, and child will be killed. So, one of the key aspects of proving genocide, the technical term is mens rea. That's just a fancy Latin term, wholly unnecessary, but if you want to sound smart, you will use it. It just means you have to demonstrate intent, that you can't just commit the acts of genocide, you have to demonstrate you were intending to commit a genocide. And if we're to believe the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, the intent for every Israeli who had gone through their educational system was clear: to kill every man, woman, and child in Gaza. And then you have the statement by the defense minister, Gallant. Gallant said, we are not going to allow in any food, fuel, electricity, or water. Now you ask yourself a very simple question, and here it does not require multiple degrees in nutrition or biology. If you have a captive population in a concentration camp, and you deny them any food, fuel, electricity, and water, what's going to happen? And for 20 days, that's exactly what Israel did. Then the pressure came from the Biden administration that outright genocide, it's a bad look in an election year. So they pretended that they were moderating or modifying that order. But already by November, Human Rights Watch put out a report that stated Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. And by now, every UN official, and I would add even EU, their foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, he said Israel's using famine as a weapon. If you understand the picture and your mind is allowed to connect the dots, of course they targeted the World WCK, the World Central Kitchen. Of course they targeted those 8 people. They don't want aid to come in to northern Gaza. Why? Because they want a famine. That's their goal. Giara Island. They'll face the prospect of either starvation or leave. Human Rights Watch. They're using starvation as a weapon of war, and these humanitarian organizations, they complicate the plans, so you terrorize them into leaving. Okay, that just leaves me one subject of where do we stand now? And where are we headed? And they're interrelated. Where do we stand now? I would say there were unexpected positive developments, and I have a lot of trouble using that sort of language because there is no silver lining in a genocide. That's just a basic fact. It's not a cliche. It's a fact. I'll tell you, because it just leapt to mind, I'll tell you just a little anecdote from my family life. So there was what was called the partisan song of the Jewish partisans during World War II, of which there weren't that many. It's vastly exaggerated, the scale, but let's acknowledge it. And that partisan song came to be called the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Song, because during World War II, there was an uprising of modest proportions. Again, I think it's vastly exaggerated. There was an uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, and it happens that both of my parents were not in the uprising, but they were in the Warsaw Ghetto at that point. And one of the lyrics in the partisan song is, I have a horrible voice, so I wouldn't want to inflict it on you, but never say that you have reached the very end. The leaden skies, the future does prevent. But the one lyric at the end goes, but the marching steps will thunder that we survive. The marching steps will thunder that we survive. Da, 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 da. Who knows it? Don't tell me no one in this room knows it, okay? I guess you know it?
Yeah, but I'm not.
Well, just sing one lyric. Why not? Okay. There's a very beautiful edition by Paul Robeson.
Yes.
In any event, and I remember my mother's reaction was, the lyrics infuriated her. What do you mean the marching steps will thunder we survive? We were all exterminated. So I have to always be careful when I speak to a silver lining in the cloud, but there have been several which I'll just say I'll take notice of. First of all, the heroic, dignified, and highly professional intervention of South Africa in the conflict. They had no dog in this race. It took a lot of sheer moral courage for them to challenge the United States and go to the ICJ. And their performance, if we could use that word, has been really exemplary, beginning with the application they filed, which is 84 single-spaced pages and with literally hundreds and hundreds of footnotes. It was a very professional job. They were serious. It was not just a show. And for those of you who haven't followed the proceedings, they have gone a second time to the court. They've gone a third time to the court. They are persisting. It's a long-distance runner. I know a couple of people in the South African delegation. One of them is John Dugard, who was the family lawyer for Nelson Mandela's family and the family lawyer for Bishop Tutu. He's 87 years old, and you saw him a little bit uncertain in his step as he went up to the podium to present part of the case by South Africa. He still has a crackerjack mind, and it's just a very inspiring thing to behold. There was the second unexpected development, leaving aside the totally unexpected, that the court would rule 15-2. I would have bet every dollar I own and every dollar that everybody in this room owns, there was no way on God's earth the U.S. would vote along. The U.S. delegate in the court is an American. The president is an American. And the German voted along, which really surprised me because the Germans, they're very protective of their genocides. They want to be the only country in the world that committed genocide, so they're very protective not to bestow that honor as they see it on Israel. But however hesitantly, the German, and he was very hesitant, Nolte is his name. He was very hesitant, but he went along with many qualifications, but he went along. The second, on a different level, or as they would say, a different register, are the Houthis. And my hat's off to them. It's easy to look down on them as being primitive, backward, some throwback to the Middle Ages. But I'm always reminded, and since this is a college audience, I'm always reminded when I see incidents like the Houthis of something that Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote in the second discourse. And he said in the second discourse, I know that sounds very academic, but it's well worth reading. He says, don't fool yourself. It's not reason that makes us humane. It's not reason that makes us decent. He says it's a faculty, an inborn faculty. It's the faculty of pity, P-I-T-Y, the faculty of pity, which humanizes us. He said men would be nothing but monsters. That's his words. Men would be nothing but monsters were it not for the faculty of pity. And then he goes on to say, the more educated you become, the more you learn how to stifle the voice of pity. First of all, you develop all of these mental ruses to justify not doing anything in the face of horrors that are unfolding before your eyes. He says, what is a philosopher? A philosopher is somebody who looks out his window, sees a horror taking place in the streets, and then stops up his ears and says, quote, perish if you will, I am safe. You figure out all these reasons why not to do anything. And the Houthis, like Rousseau's Noble Savage, they haven't developed that capacity, and so they respond with what that faculty of pity tells them, and not least because they too suffered from a man-made famine, this one by Saudi Arabia, which the United States subsidized in critical ways, which caused the deaths, the starvation to death of tens of thousands of Yemenis in 2000, I think 15 to 16, if my memory is correct, but you can correct me on that. And so the faculty of pity. And the third, unsung, but not unsung anymore, the third unsung heroes are the young people in our country and around the world who have demonstrated incredible creativeness, conscientiousness, and most of all, tenacity. I would never have believed that they would keep coming out 6 and 7 months later. That's very impressive. It's impressive not least because if you look at other situations, say during the Vietnam War era, I would be the last one to deny that there was a lot of idealism and genuine compassion for the horrors that the U.S. was inflicting on the Vietnamese people. I'm not going to say but, I'll just say, and it was true that a part of the anti-war movement grew out of the fact that young people, men, were facing the very real prospect of a draft and dying in Vietnam. There was what was called back then the lottery. And the lottery simply meant they took every birthday, 365 birthdays, put it in a hat, and then they picked it out, the numbers, one by one. And if your birthday was within the top 100, you were going over. So there was, you might call, a personal stake. I'm not saying that was the primary motivation, but it was an aspect of the anti-war movement. Your generation, or I should say your demonstrations of your generation, it's pure, it's really pristine. It's, your generation has the expression, if you'll permit me to use it, friends with benefits. But this movement has been solidarity without benefits. It's the highest form of idealism and moral nobility. So your generation will be remembered for two things. Friends with benefits. I'm afraid that's all that your generation is going to be remembered. That too has been deeply inspiring. I remember a few months ago I attended a demonstration right here at Washington Square Park. It was a rainy Saturday, it was pouring. And so the demonstration was all umbrellas. One thing I could make out though was approximately 40 years separated me from the next oldest person in the demonstration, a sobering moment, as they say. What struck me was we marched from Washington Square Park to the New York City Public Library at 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue. And then we broke up and a large number of us went down to the subway platform to go either uptown or downtown. And it was very striking to me that even on the subway platform, there was two sides of the tracks, those going up, those going downtown. And still they were chanting and chanting and chanting in solidarity with the people of Gaza. I was with a friend of mine, a fellow, and he said, you know, they don't even have a dog in this race. It's a very hopeful sign about humanity and a hopeful sign about the future. And I'm going to leave it off there and then hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the people repressed will rise up, and Matt Turner is a hero. I don't know if you got the Goofy story right, but you know, there's a lot of the leaders who've been educated in Canada.
I know the leaders,
but you know,
the people,
we can leave that.
Yeah.
I'll just, if we don't mind, I know there's a lot of people leaving. It's late and we're hungry, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who have a lot of questions also. I'm just going to throw just maybe one quick one, maybe two, but you know, first of all, thank you for the backstory. Thank you for all the lead up, because this insistence on October 7th, the beginning of everything, it erases a lot of things, obviously, the deep history, but also the immediate past of that period, which you mentioned in terms of Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf regimes, many of the Arab regimes, especially the Gulf regimes, as they come into, you know, owning Manchester City football teams and bringing Louvre museums and, you know, all that oil money, and as a result, starting to normalize relations and leaving behind a lot of others. But also during that period, and I wonder if you can comment on that, or if you want to, but through the summer and the early fall, there were daily attacks in the West Bank. So one of the things that's become kind of erased a lot through this is the West Bank also. Is that there were daily attacks under the watchful eye of the IDF, burning of property, of trees, of houses, including killings and so on. And some of which continues today also. But I wonder how you put that into the picture as well.
There are several things to say. First of all, we're at, in my opinion, I don't like to sound like a Cassandra, a prophetess of doom.
You're just being optimistic.
Well, as I said, you might want to call that a silver lining in the cloud, but it's a very dark cloud. There are serious possibilities, in my opinion, of things going completely over the precipice now. Israel has 3 goals. There is to solve the Gaza question. There is to teach a lesson to the Hezbollah. And there is the looming question of also using this opportunity to solve the Iran question. If we go that route, it's unlikely that it won't spread in the global, it won't be a global reaction. And one aspect is if there's a war with the Hezbollah, it will, in my opinion, inevitably mean there will be an ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. So that what you described that's been going on the last year will be a prelude to cleansing the West Bank. And I would say the prospects are very grim right now. Israel is in a, I would say, it's in a lunatic state right now. It's not just the state, it's also the society. The most recent statistics I read are that as of, I think, February, only 3.2% of the Israeli Jewish population, only 3.2% believe Israel is using too much force in Gaza. So when you hear these attempts to isolate the problem as being Prime Minister Netanyahu and what is called the far right in Israel, I think that is a distortion of the reality that at this point in Israeli society, not only is there no left, there is also no center. There is a right, a far right, and an ultra right. That's the entire Israeli spectrum. And I don't believe that spectrum, either at the level of society or at the level of the state, I do not believe they can be counted on to act as these events unfold. I don't believe they could be counted on to act rationally. For those of you, some of you may have read Professor Chomsky's book, The Fateful Triangle, which was written ages ago now, 1983. In the very last chapter, the very last section of the last chapter, he talks about this phenomenon in Israeli society, this Samson mentality. And the Samson mentality is that we are going to take down, if push comes to shove, if we're up against the wall, we're going to take down all, and now I'm quoting Professor Chomsky, who's quoting somebody else, we're going to take down all the goyim with us, which is Samson brings down the temple, but this is bringing down the whole world with us. A nuclear catastrophe, which is, I would say, not wanting to sound like a Cassandra, but I would say there is a significant possibility of that. Even Israel's chief historian, who I quoted at the very beginning, Benny Morris, he's written that Israel, and I'm being very careful in quoting him, he has said, if the United States doesn't join in an attack on Iran, then Israel will have to go at it alone, and being alone, will have to use non-conventional weapons, which is to say, nuclear weapons. Were that to happen, and now I want you to bear in mind, I'm talking about a very secular, lucid, Cambridge-educated historian. He is talking about nuking Iran. That has to unleash a reaction not just from Iran, but from the Hezbollah. And they have, the estimates are, they have 150,000 missiles and other projectiles of a significant number of them of a very high technical capacity. I would say at that point, it's over. Hezbollah is chomping at the bit. Sayed Israel, the head of Hezbollah, is a very smart guy. He's a very serious guy. I will never take those things away from him. And I learn when I read his speeches. But for reasons, because of his sense of Muslim pride, Arab pride, he, at this point, if you listen to his speeches, no longer believes there's any possibility of coexisting with Israel, which is not an altogether irrational reaction after the last 6 months of his protracted genocide. And so, if there is an attack on Iran, right now what holds him back is the Lebanese people, because they know if there's a war with Hezbollah, Israel will go in and do to Lebanon what it did to Gaza. And it was already a prefiguring of that in 2006 during the war, July-August war in Lebanon. So if Israel attacks Iran and uses nuclear weapons, and even if it doesn't use nuclear weapons, I do believe that the Hezbollah will unleash a barrage which will bring us to a terminal point. I'll just make one obvious observation, because I do believe Israelis are certifiably crazy. I do. I think that's a problem. Countries get that way. If you look at Germany and Japan in the last 2 years of the war, they were crazy. They weren't crazy. The states were crazy. Just take the case of the last events. Iran unleashes about 300 drones and missiles. Let's not quarrel over the quantity, the quality, or the intention. That's open for debate. You know, everybody has their own opinion of what Iran was trying to do. Okay? Let's leave that aside. I'm not going to enter into that debate because I think it's futile to try to figure it out. And it's agreed 3 rockets or missiles got through. Okay? So roughly 1%. They hit a military base, they hit something else. Okay? There's a consensus in that. And everybody is celebrating it as a victory for Israel, a victory for the Western world, because the US is apparently responsible for bringing down more than half of the drones, which were very slow-moving drones. But okay, let's accept all that. You won't make light of it, and you won't enter into the debate. Here's the simple point to my simpleton's mind. You sent over 300 drones and missiles, possibly quite antiquated, obsolete technology, but let's leave that aside. 3 get through. If the estimates are correct, that Hezbollah, let's leave aside Iran, Hezbollah has 150,000. That means, using the 1%, 1,500 would get through. Israel is a very small place. Tiny place. I was just talking to a Syrian Jew on the boardwalk. We met him. And he said, yeah, I was there last night. It's a very small place. Now, if you know Hezbollah, they're extremely efficient. They are driven. They are fanatical in a good sense and in a bad sense. You have students in your high school class. They're fanatical to succeed. It's a good thing and it's a bad thing, as you know. They're impressive, but the ambition grates on you. Okay? And they're the same way. They are driven. The level of discipline, commitment, it's, depending on your point of view, very impressive or very scary. Okay? They know Israel like the janitors in this building know this auditorium. They know every seat. They'll tell you where the ammonia plant is in Haifa. They'll tell you where this plant is here, that plant is there. If 1,500 well-placed, sophisticated missiles get through, it's something to contemplate and something which we wouldn't want to contemplate. And that's where we hang now. It's a very scary moment. And I do believe your generation or your group has a role it could play now. I do believe it could stop the impending assault on Rafah. I agree with many of your demands, the ceasefire now, the divest, of course, all those students who were suspended have to be returned to their places at the university. Not everyone is a baroness, like President Shafiq. Those are hard-working students who struggle to get to where they are. And they are not going to be suspended. They are going back into the classroom. And there will be no ifs, ands, or buts about that. They will not be suspended. But in addition to that, there was, for those of you who know a little bit of the radical history tradition, there was a famous series of events in the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War. And it was an attempt to bring democracy to Spain. There were these fascist generals who engaged in an insurgency to overthrow the Spanish Republic. And there was a famous character named La Pasionaria. Who's heard of La Pasionaria? Raise your hands up high. Very few, it's just regrettable. Her name was Dolores Ibarburi. And when the fascist generals were marching on Madrid, the famous slogan of hers was, "No pasaran, no pasaran, they shall not pass. They won't enter Madrid." And I feel that in the spirit of that slogan, your people should have the slogan, "No pasaran, he will not enter Rafah." That will not pass. Because if it does, if you look at the most recent report of the International Crisis Group, it says there are two possibilities. Either he doesn't enter Rafah, or if they do, it will be mass famine. Tens of thousands of people will die. That's the prospect we're facing now. I think if there's a united message across the college campuses in our country, no pasaran, you will not enter Rafah. It could have even just for 3 weeks until your graduation day. It could have an impact because they are concerned about what's happening in the college campuses. And I would, in my opinion, I would try to maximize the potential that you have by homing in on that slogan. We will not, just as we will not allow those students to be suspended, that is a principle. It's a principle of solidarity. When one worker was dismissed unfairly, all the workers went out on strike. And it's the same principle here. Those students struggle, many of them, struggle to get to where they are. And that barrenness is not going to destroy their future. That's not going to happen.
I was going to ask about that, but I think at this point in time, it's better if I open up to the audience. I'm sure many have similar questions about where we're at today, given the last week of repression, given the crackdowns, given the police action. So I'm going to ask you to come here. Maybe we can take 2 or 3 at a time. Is that okay? So people can have a chance to say something. So if you have a question, please. On your way out, you got one thing.
Hi, I'm Alex Lands with the Mayday Student Organization. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your talk. My question was about the Abraham Accords of 2020. Since the Students for Justice in Palestine have had a lot of discussions about this sequence in which many Arab states have effectively sold out the Palestinians while trying to normalize relations with Israel. And so my question is, do you have any general thoughts you'd like to share with us about the future of the so-called normalization process in the coming year, considering your remarks that you made about the aspirations and hopes of the Palestinians who are, because of the fact that they are fighting, is the reason why this so-called normalization process is being disrupted. Thank you again.
Let's take one more.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Harrison. I'm from a group called the Maoist Communist Union. And you were talking about the 60s and like the importance of the student movement there. And it was getting me to think about how a lot of students realized not only that there was a need to oppose the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War, but to oppose U.S. imperialism as a whole. And then more importantly, actually, the role of the working class in needing to play a lead in ending U.S. imperialism and in taking lead in the movement to end U.S. imperialism. And because there's a lot of, I'm saying this because there's a lot of unions right now, and a lot of union members who have been struggling to put forward ceasefire resolutions, like in the UAW and the AFL, even unions where there's been more opposition to that. Like I know in the Teamsters, there's a lot of members, I have some comrades in there who have been struggling to push for a ceasefire resolution. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on how the student movement that's developing right now can link up with the working class movement in opposing what's going on in Palestine. I mean, opposing the genocide in Palestine.
I'm not going to comment extensively on the Abraham Accords, except to say what's perfectly obvious, that there is a major rivalry in the Middle East between what's sometimes called, and it's not my term, I'm just quoting it, the axis of resistance, which is led by Iran, and those who are fearful of the consequences of the axis of resistance, and that's primarily Saudi Arabia, and now in its fears is trying to have an open alliance, not just with Israel, but more importantly, with the United States. On the second question, and that's why usually when I give a talk over the past 40 years, about 1/3 of the audience leaves after the presentation, and about 2/3 stays because they want to gather as much information as possible. And I want to take advantage of the folks who have stayed and try to focus on issues of tactics and strategy. Now, I have to be careful about this because my friend, comrade, webmaster, and the brains behind my endeavors, Sana Kassam, who's Palestinian, she lives in Greece. She says there's a time and place for everything, and that you shouldn't criticize in every venue. So, this is not a criticism. This is the core, the 2/3 who stayed, and we're having a conversation. I think that one of the things I've learned in politics, and I learned it very belatedly, is that sometimes politics comes down to, I know this will sound silly, but politics sometimes comes down to slogans, political slogans. A political slogan is a synthesis and a consolidation of a whole political worldview. That's what a good slogan is. And it has many, many sides to it. If you were to ask me what were the best political slogans in your lifetime and mine, I would say the best political slogans were the ones of Bernie Sanders. Whatever you might think of him, and we're all free to express our extreme disappointment in him, at least at the beginning of the assault on Gaza, he understood certain things about politics because he'd been at it for 40 years. Number one, you have to choose a slogan that has a very broad resonance, that's meaningful to a lot of people. Medicare for all was very meaningful to about 80% of Americans. So you have the possibility of reaching a large number of people. Abolish student debt, abolish college tuition. Anybody who talks to young people like yourselves in the room, or mostly yourselves in the room, knows that no conversation with a person your age can last more than a half hour before the student starts talking about debt. That's student debt. I could be walking on the boardwalk, I could be walking in the street, and when I say, what are you doing with your life? And within that half hour, the student debt comes up, which, by the way, never existed in my generation. I know you'll find that very hard to believe. There was no student debt in my generation, none. First of all, most schools were free. Brooklyn city colleges were free, state universities were free. Columbia, which was the maximum at the time was $3,000 a year with tuition and everything. It was $3,000 a year. And even factoring in inflation, it's still a lot less than today. And the fact of the matter was, I know you're going to find this very hard to believe, very few people who had loans. I only, from my kindergarten to my PhD, finishing my PhD, I only had one loan. I borrowed $3,000 from my mother when I was in graduate school, and that was it. I never returned it to her because I thought that was a bond. I was bonding, so I didn't return. But that was it. We never had loans. Now, there were some people who took out loans, and you know what? I know you'll find they took out what were called federal loans at the time. And you know what? Everybody defaulted, and the government didn't care. And there was no credit rating. There weren't things like, checking credit rating. That stuff didn't exist back then. So what you're burdened with now is something totally new. It's like feudalism, what's happening with this student debt. So Bernie understood Medicare for all, student debt, student tuition, those things, they're going to resonate. They would reach a very large audience. And he was very smart about it. Every opportunity he had, he kept saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. People would go, why doesn't he say something different? He's always saying the same thing. Because he understood. 99% of Americans were only hearing once. They're not critical junkies. They'll hear it once. He wasn't going to miss any opportunity to keep hammering away. Now, I think your generation, right now, your movement, let's forget generation, your movement has to be very careful, cautious, smart, and responsible when it comes to your slogans. One of them was very smart, and it happened spontaneously and intuitively. Namely, very quickly, your movement latched onto ceasefire now. Now, that was a piece of happenstance. It didn't have to be that slogan, but you, I think, intuitively understood that was a very important slogan. Ceasefire now. We have to be honest about it. It is not an adequate slogan, because ceasefire now could be ceasefire for 2 weeks until the hostages are out, and then Israel finishes the job in Gaza, or finishes the genocide in Gaza. And even if ceasefire meant permanent ceasefire, that just means a return to the status quo ante October 7th. Then what was the whole point of October 7th and everything thereafter if the best you can hope for was a long-term ceasefire? There was a ceasefire in Gaza, occasionally interrupted like in 2021, but basically from protected edge forward. And October 7th was the reaction to the ceasefire. So it's not a fully adequate slogan, but it's still the right slogan for the moment. I think that's correct, because it isolates Israel and Israel's supporters who are opposed to the ceasefire. Having said that, and here I suspect we'll have disagreement, and we should feel free to disagree with each other. In my opinion, the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," it's a bad slogan. Why? Number one, because of its ambiguity. Slogans have to be crystal clear. There has to be no wiggle room, no ambiguity. Because the moment there's wiggle room or ambiguity, the other side seizes on it to discredit you. Now, you're going to say, well, the other side's going to do that anyway, and that's true. But you shouldn't make it easy for them. The slogan should be crystal clear about what you mean. Now, the question then becomes, well, what do you mean by that slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine"? What exactly do you mean? Some people say it means A. Some people say it means B. That we want a Palestine where Palestinians have their freedom. But other people think it means there won't be an Israel, which I can get, but then that still leaves the looming question mark of, will there be Jews? Some of you think there shouldn't be. And there's a whole history of that. We can't deny it. In South Africa, there were two leading groups. One was called the African National Congress, of which the leader, as most of you know, was Nelson Mandela. But there was a second leading group, the Pan-African Congress, and it was headed by a fellow named Robert Sobukwe. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right. The African National Congress, their slogan was, "One person, one vote." That was their slogan. One person, one vote. South African Congress said, "Africa for the Africans." The Europeans have to leave. They have to return. If you listen now to Nasrallah's speeches, he's basically taken that position. The Israelis, as he says, have 2 passports. They should use their other passport and go back to the UK, go back to France, go back to where they came from. I think there should be clarity among your group, your movement. What do you want? And then it should be expressed. In my view, from the river to the sea, 1 person, 1 vote, Palestinians will be free. That's the right slogan. Put in 1 person, 1 vote. Because the moment you say that, the other side has no answer. Now, some of you are thinking, I don't want 1 person, 1 vote. Palestine is Arab land, I want them to leave. The non-Arabs to leave, or non-Muslim Arabs to leave. That's something you folks will have to think through on your own. But I do believe that you shouldn't make it easier for the other side by having wiggle room in your slogans, which can be easily misconstrued to discredit. And it requires just simple tweaking from the river to the sea. 1 person, 1 vote, Palestinians will be free. That to me is a more effective slogan for 2 reasons. Number 1, there's no wiggle room there. And number 2, it completely isolates the other side. We can't answer that. What's wrong with 1 person, 1 vote? Okay.
Thank you for the prescription, although I don't think it's wise to attribute to a you certain kinds of views right now, which I doubt people here hold. We have 3 more questions. We'll take them at a time, and I think that'll be right. That's the end of the energy in the room.
Hi, my name is Austin. I'm from a group called Maoist Communist Union. I heard earlier your co-host say that you were once a Maoist. I wanted to know why you no longer are a Maoist, and if you see revolution as being possible or necessary.
I'm going to exercise my discretion, and because of the impending and ongoing horrors in Gaza, I am going to forego burdening you with a sad chapter in my life. Though I'm never averse to admitting I'm wrong, and most of the time I'm wrong. I'm happy to be wrong when my forecasts are dire. Like, I would be very happy to be wrong about what might be an impending apocalypse now. But I don't believe I was entirely wrong when I was your age. I made errors of judgment for sure.
Hi, my name is Abou. I'm also a Maoist, and I think it's really interesting that we're all asking questions. My question is a little bit more pointed, and I think a little bit more related to the situation at hand, which is, do you think a national or socialist revolution is possible in Palestine, and what that might look like?
Can all the other Maoists please come up as well?
So my name is Milo. How do you feel about how you got into today's particular situation, which is the room that we are in and the timing of it and how it was attempted to be pushed back? How do you take that in the context of neoliberalism and how it's accepted in this specific New York community? Like, not this isn't like this room, but it isn't like New York.
Hi, I'm Diamond. And my question is, how do you handle having conversations about self-defense when a lot of liberals seem to think the only way to get the message through is by being peaceful, but if somebody's choking you, you have to put your hands on them to remove their hands from choking you. So my question is, how do you really explain to people the fact that violence is used as a tool to alter and also sustain oppressive systems, but also to fight against them? Thank you.
We'll do the last one. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Gretel. Thank you for speaking. I'm wondering about how you oppose three quote-unquote terrorist organizations differently, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. Hamas and the Houthis have both grown out of places subjected to immense USA-sponsored violence. Yet you took pity on the struggle of Hamas and compared it to the Nat Turner rebellion, but called the Houthis primitive. And then also called Hezbollah a very intelligent organization, so I'm wondering where the discrepancy arises from.
There were three questions, and I'll try to answer them in sequence. The first question was about socialist revolution, prospects for it, and so forth. What I would say is, one of the things when you try to look at these things through an analytical lens is trying to make sense of what's going on around you. What accounts for this sense of identification and with a tacit commitment to the people of Gaza? They are about 2 million people. They are stateless. They are powerless. They're very far away from the reality of our city or our country. And yet, as I said, there's this tenacious, self-sacrificing commitment. And so where does it come from? And for me, it is an interesting question. How do you account for it? And part of it, and this gets back to that first question, is I believe for many young people, your benighted generation, which is having to bear the very rotten fruits of this thing called neoliberalism, which is just a technical term for untrammeled, unshackled capitalism without any restraints or constraints. That's what you're experiencing. Obviously, neoliberalism has other aspects to it, but I think that's its essential aspect. And for about 80% of American young people, they have no future. Remember I said the people of Gaza, those young men, they had no past, no present, and no future. Well, a lot of new people, or young people in general, about 80%, all they have to look forward to is living with their parents well into their 30s, not having sufficient money to start up a family, not having a regular job. In my day, a job meant something very, very specific. A job meant 40 hours a week, weekends off, a pension, eventually a home, picket fence. Yes, that's what a job meant. Anything else was not a job. Your generation have graduated into this thing called a gig economy, where you have to keep down 2 and 3 so-called jobs, no pension, no future, no possibility of purchasing a home. Many people well into their 30s still live with 3 other roommates. It's not Gaza, but it's the same overarching phenomenon. A no future for a whole generation. And so in my opinion, Gaza has become a metaphor for a lot of young people of this merciless, greedy system that you have inherited and graduated into. I opened up this morning's paper, and there was the big celebration of that bill that gives Israel and Ukraine billions of dollars. And the headline was, quoting Biden, "A victory for world peace." You know, I don't even know how to react to that. It's like can't think of the word right now, a satire of George Orwell. And you would even call it a bad satire. A victory for world peace, and that's what you were that's the world you're entering. So I think, yes, I don't believe this system is tenable or livable for 80% of our country and large portions of humanity. Will I live to see a dramatic change? No, that's not possible. But it's a very long call, but I do believe it's got to be done because the people who are running this world are just completely from hunger. So, on the question of violence, I'm not a pacifist. I never claimed to be. But on the other hand, there but for the grace of God go I, which is to say, I don't want to die prematurely, and I don't want to inflict that on anybody. So I think one has to behave responsibly, and responsibly means to exhaust all options short of violence before one turns to the option of violence. Bear in mind what this questioner said, of course, the whole state system is based on violence. So I have no problem saying that people have the right to use force and armed force when they're not given any other viable options. And I don't believe the people of Gaza had any other option. There is an argument which people have raised with me, and I have to grant the argument. What if Hamas had broken free of the gates of that concentration camp and just targeted military intelligence facilities? Wouldn't that have been better? But then you could make the argument that, well, wouldn't it have been better if Nat Turner just targeted soldiers and not civilians? If you read Nat Turner's, what's famously called Nat Turner's confession, he said that our goal was to target everyone at the beginning, but once we got a firm footing as a insurrectionary force, then we would have only targeted men. That's what he said. I don't know what Hamas would have done. I think I talked about it with many people, trying to get points of view, and they said, well, Hamas was sending the message that if our civilians are not safe, your civilians won't be safe. It's not a pretty message. I would have to say, however, I read what happened in Operation Cast Lead, Operation Protective Edge. In Cast Lead, 350 children were killed. In Protective Edge, 550 children were killed. In Cast Lead, 6,300 homes were destroyed. In Protective Edge, 18,000 homes were destroyed. How were they destroyed? Well, you can read it in all the Israeli publications. They went into neighborhoods, roped off neighborhoods, block by block, and then sent in the D9 bulldozers and flattened them. And I thought to myself, I remember thinking at the time, in 2016 or 2008-9, I remember thinking in Cast Lead, when I have a hiccup in my computer, okay, and I lose, at that point, computers weren't as competent as they are now, and I would lose something I had worked on for an hour or two, okay? I would start screaming, yelling, cursing my life, cursing my fate, cursing humanity. I lost 2 hours of my work, okay? And then I said to myself, 70% of these people in Gaza, 80%, are refugees, which means they lost their homeland. And now, the only thing they had left were their homes, the ones they had built in Gaza. And now, systematically, methodically, heartlessly, this army comes in, these marauders, this Genghis Khan army comes in, these Mongol hordes, and periodically just destroy all the homes. I could understand the message. If we're not safe, you're not going to be safe. It's a heartless message, but I kind of get it. What can I tell you? As to the third question,
There's one about the
yes, I know about the Houthis, the Hezbollah, and the
Mongol.
hold on, and the Hamas. I was struck, if you will allow me, first of all, if there's a belief that somehow I insulted any group of people, it was very far from it. I hope some of you will have a chance in your college career. I kind of resonate to a lot of what Rousseau said. I often tell my students when we read that particular passage in Rousseau about pity, and he says the more educated you are, this is Rousseau, the less you are vulnerable to the faculty of pity. And Rousseau has a famous scene where he says, whenever you're out in the street and there's a street fight, let's say two guys duking it out, taking out their knives, he says, and I'm quoting him now, the prudent man, meaning the educated man, the prudent man, he says, walks away. And then he says, it's always the market woman, the uneducated, what we would call nowadays the fish market woman. It's always the market woman who breaks up the fight. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I say to my students, imagine you are in Central Park in the dead of night, 2 or 3 a.m. I won't ask you why you were there, but you're there, in dead of night. And then the misfortune strikes. A mother comes up to you and puts a gun to your head. At that moment, your guardian angel descends and gives you two options. You, of course, with the gun to your head, you're going to let out that primal scream. Help! You get it. And then your guardian angel says, you have two choices. Would you prefer a graduate of Harvard Business School passing by when you let out that, or would you prefer a fisherman from southern Italy, fresh off the boat, when you let out that help? Now, of course, there's always one smart-ass student who says, of course I would choose the Harvard businessman. I would choose the Harvard business graduate because he probably would have a cell phone. But leaving that possibility aside, virtually everybody always says, and I've done this test the whole of my adult teaching career, they all say they would prefer to have that fisherman from southern Italy. And it struck me, a friend of mine, Jamie Sternweiner, he sent me this thing from this thing called TikTok. I don't know what it is. But he sent me, and it was footage of two Yemenis, fishermen, two Yemeni fishermen. And they were anti-Houthi, because as you know, there's a civil war in Yemen. They were anti-Houthi. And they said because of the standoff between the American vessels and the Houthis, they're not able to fish anymore. And they're losing a huge amount of their income. But then they said, but for the people of Palestine, we don't care if we're losing our income. We still support, even though it's costing us a lot, we still support them. And when I saw that image, it reminded me of my little thought experiment with my students based on Rousseau. So I don't consider it any kind of condescension or patronizing to say, yes, many of the Houthis are simple. It's the poorest country in the Middle East. But still, even as it's poor, they are rich in humanity, which for me counts for something.
So I said this would be the last set, but I got a bunch of requests about more questions. I don't know where, do you want to take some more? How are we doing out there, first of all? Yeah? The hardcore two-thirds remaining. Do you want to take?
Yes, I'm fine.
Yeah, okay, so I think we have two more.
Thank you.
I won't let you speak unless you sing the lyrics.
So the last two lyrics are Kommen Gott nach unser ausgewogen Schof, so treibt Gott kann unser Brot mir senden doch. To all of
this and actually to your work about the Holocaust, and I feel like this is something I feel like I'm very comfortable asking you. I'm a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. My grandmother was tortured in Auschwitz with her twin sister by Josef Mengele. And so I want to ask you about what you think about the centrality. You mentioned the kind of mentions of concentration camps by Israeli officials, but the centrality of using, of talking about the Holocaust in relation to this, of making those connections and drawing these out explicitly. Of course, in your famous book, of drawing out how Israel uses the Shoah as a means of perpetuating its propaganda, and so the centrality of using it when we advocate for against what Israel is doing, the centrality of that.
There was a time where nothing counted unless it was the with a capital T and Holocaust with a capital H, the Holocaust. So invariably, when you want to discuss any kind of horror, you felt this kind of obligation to compare it with that. I would say at this point, the Palestinian situation has its own authority, its own independence, its own established reality and horror, such that it's no longer necessary to make that sort of comparison, that one simply can, as I try to do, simply refer to what the documentary record shows. Do I really have to invoke the Nazi Holocaust to make my point as regards the situation now, where literally every human rights organization and every senior official in the UN and elsewhere has said there is a famine now unfolding in Gaza. It's a human-made, human-manufactured famine, and right now, half the population is facing or on the verge of famine. A quarter of the population is experiencing famine, and that means half the population would mean 500,000 children. 500,000 children, as we speak now, are on the verge of or already experiencing famine. I think you can convey that reality, the horror of that reality, without, at this point in time, feeling the necessity to invoke the Nazi Holocaust. Now, the questioner correctly says that I did use the term concentration camp, but I wasn't the one who used that term. Giora Eiland, who among other things in recent months has said if mass disease breaks out in southern Gaza, he said that would be a good thing because that will force them to leave. And it's Giora Eiland, who can hardly be accused of being a person of the left. He's on that very specific Israeli spectrum of right, far right, and ultra right. He's somewhere there. He says Gaza was a huge concentration camp. And he said that before the blockade. So, in my view, it's not me who's guilty of the invocation, it's him. I'm simply quoting him. Okay.
Hi, Norman. I'm Palestinian, and I want to say thank you for this talk, and thank you for your academic contributions to Gaza. I truly mean this. You've covered so much that hasn't been able to be covered on the ground. But respectfully, I have to say that you have no right to tell Palestinians how to resist, let alone peacefully resist. Saying from the river to the sea means that we want free movement from the Jordan River Valley to the Mediterranean Sea, and for the right to return for Palestinians who were displaced from their villages in 48 and 67. Making it out to be anything else smears our movement. So we say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
To the river, we'll live forever. Palestine will live forever.
I say totally respectfully, people have the right to disagree. And if I'm wrong, I have no problem with saying I am wrong. It's something to think about. And then people can reach their own conclusions. I gave my reasoning, and I rely on your capacity to think it through. And I grew up with young people wearing a button. It was a black button with white words, and you might remember it. Many young people wore the button, "Question authority." And I think that was a good aspect of the era through which I passed. And Karl Marx, some of you might remember him, he was once asked the credo by which he lived, and being a smart Jewish boy, of course, he quoted in Latin, which was de omnibus dubitandum, which was to doubt everything. Or as we were, more humbly, in the 1960s, question authority. So I am not asking anyone here to defer to my authority. I would nonetheless say I have, as the young woman said, I have proved over the whole of my adult life my commitment to the cause, and also I feel an obligation based on experience, and life experience, in my opinion, counts for something, both life experience and book knowledge, both of which are valuable, to say that we have to be very careful, cautious, and responsible and wise as we construct slogans, because in many ways, slogans, as I say, crystallize, consolidate an entire politics. And it tells a lot about a movement, its moral character, its conviction, its aspiration. A slogan tells a lot about that movement. And so we should be very careful and cautious as we choose the slogans by which we will be judged.
I want to thank the organizers again after the event, the student groups that put this together, invited Norman Finkelstein to campus. Thank all of you for staying here, and those of you who are staying outside, for staying outside in the encampment that's still going. And I know it's tiring, but I think there's things that can be achieved in the next little stretch, and we can focus on those from here on. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone. We just wanted to once again thank everyone for being here, and